Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something a lot of you have been asking about: DIY solar for emergency power. And to really dig into this, we've got a ton of resources, articles, forum discussions, even YouTube channels from people who've gone full-on off-grid with their setups.
Yeah, it's amazing to see what people have been able to create. We'll be looking at everything from, those small budget-friendly systems to just keep a few things going during a blackout, all the way up to those like whole home systems for people who really want to live that off-grid life.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to break down for you. Whether you're just kind of dipping your toes into the solar world or you're ready to dive headfirst into DIY off-grid, we've got you covered. But before we jump into all that, let's talk about the why. Like, why is DIY solar backup even a thing?
Well, when the power goes out, what do you really start to miss? I think about the fridge keeping food from going bad, the phone to stay connected, lights so you're not stumbling around in the dark.
Totally. And here's something I learned that kind of blew my mind. Having those regular solar panels on your roof doesn't actually mean you're automatically covered if the power goes out.
Right. Most grid-tied solar systems, they're actually designed to shut down when the grid goes offline. It's a safety thing to stop them from sending power back into lines that might be down, which could be dangerous for utility workers.
Yeah, that makes sense, but it really makes you realize you need a separate backup system if you want to be truly prepared. Remember those crazy power outages in Texas a while back? Tons of people on Reddit were saying their fancy solar panels were completely useless.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be a massive event like that. Even something small and local, like a tree falling on a power line or, a transformer blowing, that can totally disrupt your life.
Right.
Having that DIY backup system gives you that peace of mind and, control over your own power.
Okay, so we're convinced backup power is important, but where do we even begin?
One good place to start is an article we found from the Alti store. They lay out a pretty basic setup that's perfect for those essential devices during an outage. Think like a 30-watt solar panel, a charge controller, a battery, and an inverter.
Okay, break that down for us. How does the electricity actually move through that whole system?
Imagine it kind of like a chain reaction. The solar panel captures that sunlight and turns it into DC electricity. The charge controller acts like, a traffic cop, making sure the flow of electricity to the battery is regulated and doesn't get overloaded. The battery stores that energy, and then the inverter converts that stored DC power into AC power, which is what all your devices use.
So the power goes out, you flip the switch on your DIY system, and what can you run with that kind of setup? The Alti article mentions stuff like a router, a tablet, a phone.
Yeah.
Pretty basic stuff, but it makes you think, what are your absolute must-have devices during an outage?
It's a good question to consider. What do you absolutely need to, stay connected, informed, and, as comfortable as possible during an outage? This smaller system probably won't run your fridge or AC, but it could be the difference between feeling totally stressed and feeling prepared.
And here's the cool part. You're not just building this for emergencies. This same setup can be used year-round for things like camping trips, powering a shed, maybe even a small workshop. That versatility is pretty awesome.
For sure. When you invest in a DIY solar solution, you're not just getting one thing, you're getting multiple benefits: emergency preparedness, greater independence, and, the ability to use clean energy in all sorts of situations.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Ready for some unexpected ingenuity? We came across the stuff on Instructables about how to make DIY solar cells using powdered donuts.
Yep. Sounds crazy, but it's true. The key is titanium dioxide, which, believe it or not, you can get from those sugary treats. You need a few other things too, like conductive glass, graphite, and iodine, but it's mind-blowing that something as simple as a powdered donut can be part of creating a solar cell.
It's like kitchen science magic.
Yeah.
Now, we won't get too deep into the chemistry here. The main point is it's actually possible to make a solar cell from things you might just have laying around your house.
Yeah.
Of course, the output is pretty low, more for demonstration or learning than actually powering your house.
Right, but it makes that connection to the technology, It makes solar energy feel more accessible and understandable. Who knows? Maybe it sparks an idea for some future inventors out there.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about small-scale backup. Now let's shift gears and talk about those who are aiming for that full-on off-grid lifestyle. We found this awesome YouTube channel called Tiny Shiny Home, and they documented their whole journey of building this huge DIY solar system to power their entire homestead.
And what's really interesting is their reason for doing it. They mentioned that getting connected to the grid would have cost them something like $35,000. So by going DIY, they were able to build a much larger system for about half the price.
Talk about a good reason to go DIY. So they built this massive system but they also made some important decisions along the way. Things that anyone thinking about doing this will need to consider.
For sure. They went with a 48-volt battery system, which they explain is more efficient for converting to the standard 120 volts most homes use. They also decided to skip 220 volts for now. They're focusing on powering their essential appliances. But they were smart and designed the system to be expanded later on. And they chose lithium batteries, which have some definite pros and cons compared to those more traditional lead-acid batteries.
And their experience getting those batteries is a story in itself. They went through Alibaba to try and get a better price, but they ran into all sorts of problems. They even ended up with a different type of battery than what they ordered.
It really highlights the challenges and uncertainties that can come with DIY. You have to be okay with doing research, troubleshooting, and maybe even being a little flexible when things don't go exactly to plan. But for them, it was worth it. They saved a ton of money and really learned a lot about their system along the way.
All right, so we've talked about why DIY solar matters. We've seen small, large-scale systems in action. Now let's break down those actual components in a bit more detail because things are about to get technical.
They are. But that's where the real learning happens, right? And don't worry, we'll connect it all back to, your needs and what you're trying to achieve. So let's start with the heart of it all, the solar panels.
All right, solar panels. What are the big things we got to know when we're picking these out?
Well, one of the first things you'll run into is monocrystalline versus polycrystalline panels. They both, turn sunlight into electricity, but there are some key differences.
Okay, so give us the rundown. What's the difference and why should we care?
So monocrystalline panels, they're made from a single, super pure silicon crystal. And polycrystalline panels are made from multiple silicon fragments. And this difference in how they're made actually affects how efficient they are and even how they look.
So is one better than the other?
It depends on what you're looking for and your budget. Monocrystalline panels are usually considered more efficient, so they make more power from the same amount of sunlight. They also tend to work better when it's not super bright out and have that, sleek black look, but they do usually cost more.
Gotcha. So more power, sleek look, but you pay for it. Yeah. What about polycrystalline then?
Well, polycrystalline panels are less efficient, but they're easier on the wallet. They might be a good choice if you've got a lot of space and you want to get the most power for your money.
Okay, that makes sense. More power per square foot versus just a lower cost overall. Interesting. Are there any other options we should be thinking about?
Absolutely. We've been talking about new panels, but don't rule out used or recertified solar panels.
Used panels. Is that safe? Are they reliable?
That's a good question. Remember those tiny, shiny home folks we talked about? They actually found a company called Santan Solar that buys used panels tests and recertifies them and then sells them at a discount. They got an amazing deal and saved a ton of money.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So you don't have to spend a fortune to get started with DIY solar. Okay, so we've picked out our panels. What's next on the list?
Next up is the charge controller. This thing is like the unsung hero of any solar system. It controls the flow of electricity from the panels to the battery, making sure the battery doesn't get overcharged, and basically keeping it healthy.
Okay, but how do we choose the right charge controller? Is there a certain size we need?
We found a really helpful guide on Instructables that explains all that. The size you need depends on how much power your solar panel puts out and the voltage of your battery system. Basically, you want a controller that can handle the max current and voltage coming from your panels.
Sounds like there's some math involved.
There is, but don't worry. There are tons of calculators and resources online that can help you figure out the exact specs you need. The important thing is to make sure your controller is the right size for your setup to avoid any damage or problems.
Okay, so charge controller checked. Now what about batteries? I feel like I keep hearing about lithium batteries everywhere. Are those the way to go for DIY solar?
Lithium batteries are definitely having a moment, and for good reason. They're lighter, smaller, and last a lot longer than those old lead-acid batteries. They also charge faster and can handle being drained more without getting damaged.
But what about that BMS thing we heard about? The tiny, shiny home folks made it sound pretty important.
Yeah, they're totally right. A BMS, or a battery management system, is super important for lithium batteries. It's like the brain of the battery pack. It's always monitoring and controlling things like the voltage temperature and how fast it's charging and discharging. Basically, it keeps the batteries running safely and smoothly so they last as long as possible.
So it sounds like if you're going with lithium batteries, you absolutely need a BMS.
Pretty much. It's essential for safety and performance. But even though lithium is the new hotness, lead-acid batteries are still a decent option, especially if you're on a tight budget.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to keep costs in mind. What are the downsides of lead acid then?
Well, they're cheaper and easier to find, but they're also a lot bigger, heavier, and need more maintenance. It comes down to what's most important to you.
Okay, so for choosing batteries, we need to think about budget, space, and maintenance. So we've got the panels collecting that sunlight, the charge controller keeping everything in check, and the battery storing all that energy. What's next? How do we actually use that stored power?
That's where the inverter comes in. Remember all that talk about DC and AC power? Well, solar panels produce DC electricity, but most of our stuff runs on AC. The inverter is that magical device that converts it for us.
So choosing the right inverter is a big deal then.
Definitely. Instructables has a great article that explains how to choose the right one. The main thing is to choose an inverter that can handle the wattage of everything you want to run. That means the total power consumption of all the devices you want to use at the same time.
So if I want to keep my fridge running some lights and maybe even a small TV during an outage, I'd need a bigger inverter than if I just wanted to power a laptop and my phone right.
Exactly. And it's not just about the power they use while they're running. You also need to factor in surge wattage. Some appliances like fridges or power tools need a burst of extra power when you first turn them on.
Oh, that makes sense. Wouldn't want to overload the inverter just trying to make coffee.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Getting the right size inverter is key. And of course, we can't forget about safety, making sure the system is grounded properly, and using lightning arresters, especially if you live in an area with lots of thunderstorms, is really important.
Okay, so we've gone through all the main parts: panels, charge controller, batteries, inverter. But here's a question. There are already pre-built solar kits out there, so why would someone choose to do it themselves instead of just buying a kit?
That's a great question, and it's something that Shop Solar actually talks about in their article on emergency solar gear. Saving money is often the main reason. Building your own system can be way cheaper than buying a pre-made kit.
But there's got to be more to it than just cost, right?
Definitely. One big advantage is customization. When you build it yourself, you can design a system that fits your exact needs and energy goals. You're not limited to whatever comes in the kit.
And I bet there's also something satisfying about building it yourself right. Knowing exactly how your system works and feeling good about creating something with your own hands.
The Tiny Shiny Home folks definitely talked about that. They were really proud of their DIY system and all the knowledge they gained along the way. It's empowering to really understand and control how you get your power.
Okay, so we've talked about why DIY solar is important. We've broken down the parts, and we've touched on why building it yourself can be better than buying a kit. But there's more to consider, right? What about actually installing and maintaining a DIY solar system? What does that involve? We've covered so much ground, from tiny systems for just the essentials all the way to those awesome off-grid homesteads. But before we wrap up, let's talk about actually getting these systems up and running. What about permits, inspections, safety codes, all that practical stuff?
Yeah, that's super important. It can be different depending on, where you live. The Tiny Shiny Home folks mentioned they had to look into their local regulations, and they even had to have their system inspected to make sure it was all up to code.
Right, you wouldn't want to put in all that work just to have an inspector tell you it's not right.
Exactly. And they were really big on making sure the wiring and grounding were done properly to avoid any fires or, other dangers.
For sure, safety is always number one. It's easy to get caught up in the building part, but you got to keep safety top of mind. Speaking of keeping things running smoothly, what about maintenance? Do these DIY solar systems need a lot of upkeep?
It really depends on what you're using for your system. Like lithium batteries, those usually need less maintenance than the lead acid kind. But no matter what you choose, it's a good idea to regularly check things like the connections wiring and just make sure everything's working the way it should.
So basically, like anything else, you got to do those regular checkups. Little preventative maintenance can save you from some big headaches later on.
Exactly. And don't forget about the internet. There are so many online communities and forums about DIY solar. People share their experiences, give advice, and help each other troubleshoot problems.
That's so true. All the Reddit threads we found while researching this were packed with helpful tips and stories of people helping each other through their DIY solar projects. It just shows how a shared interest can really bring people together.
Yeah, that sense of community can make a big difference. It takes away some of the fear, knowing you're not alone in this. There are people out there who have done this before and are willing to share what they've learned.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Imagine a future where you're not just ready for power outages, but you're making clean, renewable energy. Energy that helps you rely less on the grid and, do your part for the environment.
That's the bigger picture here, right? It's not just about convenience or saving money. It's about taking control of how you power your life and making the world a more sustainable and resilient place.
That's a pretty inspiring vision.
Yeah.
And it's something we can all be a part of, one DIY solar panel at a time. So, and everyone listening, go out there, experiment, learn, and let's create a brighter, more energy-independent future together.
And who knows, maybe we'll feature your DIY solar project on a future deep dive. Let us know how it goes.